The padlock wouldn't budge. My phone buzzed. Termination notice, bank fraud alert, credentials purged. Robert Sterling had set me up, and now 2 security goons were closing in. I swung my leather briefcase like a hammer, felt bone crack under the impact. One down, but the other was still coming. The flash drive in my pocket held the truth, but if I didn't move, I'd be the fall guy for a federal felony. The rental car's engine roared to life, my only way out. Too late to stop it. Time to run. The humidity in Houston clung to Marcus like a wet wool shroud. He stepped off the bus, adjusted the lapels of his charcoal suit, and squinted against the glare bouncing off a jagged chain-link fence. According to the digital invite, the Southern Hub headquarters occupied these coordinates. Instead, a sprawling graveyard of rusted corrugated steel and cracked asphalt greeted him. Dry weeds pushed through the concrete ribs of the lot, swaying in the hot breath of a passing freight train. The air tasted of ozone and rotting rubber. Marcus paced toward a padlocked gate where a sun-bleached sign dangled by a single wire. It didn't scream prestige. It groaned under the weight of decay. He tapped his phone screen, desperate for a GPS glitch to correct itself. He ran a hand over the rough iron of the gate, the rust staining his palm a deep, metallic orange. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, the reward for 15 years of grinding through the gears of Nexus Logistics. Robert Sterling had promised him a kingdom of glass and silicon, a hub that would redefine global trade. But as Marcus looked at the collapsed roof of a nearby warehouse, the silence of the lot felt heavy, almost predatory. There were no trucks, no workers, no hum of high-end machinery, only the distant, rhythmic clink of a loose cable hitting a metal pole. The discrepancy between the promise and the reality sat in his stomach like a cold stone. He was a man of metrics and data, and the data here was screaming that he had been led into a trap. A sharp vibration rattled his palm, breaking the oppressive stillness. "Mr. Thorne?" A voice crackled through the device's speaker. It was a voice he knew well. Clipped, professional, and entirely devoid of the warmth it had carried just 48 hours ago. "Robert Sterling sends his regards." Marcus gripped the phone until his knuckles turned ivory, the sharp edge of the sea glass in his pocket biting into his thigh. "I'm at the site, Robert. There's nothing here but scrap metal and weeds." "Where is the team? Where is the infrastructure?" "Precisely," the voice replied, followed by a clinical, high-pitched chime that signaled the end of a process. A notification banner slid across the glass, the white text blinding in the Texas sun. "Access revoked. Employee ID 8842 terminated." Before he could draw a breath to protest, a second alert flashed a violent, pulsing red. "Fraud warning. Account balance 0." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He watched the screen as his life savings, the meticulous accumulation of a decade of discipline, vanished. The digits spiraled downward like water down a drain, replaced by a mocking string of zeros. He tried to swipe back, to open his banking app, but the screen flickered and died. The phone was no longer a tool. It was a brick of glass and plastic, as useless as the rusted gate before him. The silence of the industrial wasteland deepened, surging back to fill the void left by the phone's chime. Heat shimmered off the oily puddles near his polished shoes, distorting the horizon into a wavering, liquid mirror. He stood motionless amidst the ruins, a man dressed for a boardroom in a city that had already erased his name. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wasn't just unemployed, he was being deleted. Sterling hadn't just fired him. He had initiated a scorched earth protocol. Every digital tether Marcus had to the world was being severed, one by one, leaving him standing in the dirt of a fake headquarters, a ghost in a charcoal suit. Desperation, sharp and acidic, rose in his throat. He lunged toward his rental car, a silver sedan that felt like his only remaining life raft. He needed to get to a laptop, to find a hard line, to stop the bleeding. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the jagged sea glass, its edges a grounding sting. He pulled out his car keys, but as he moved, the sound of gravel crunching behind him made his hair stand on end. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy, deliberate footfall of someone who didn't want to be heard. He spun around, his back hitting the rusted fence with a metallic groan. Two men were closing in. They wore dark, ill-fitting suits that bulged at the shoulders, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hat brims. They didn't look like corporate security. They looked like predators. "Mr. Thorne," the one on the left said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Marcus's chest. "We're here to collect the company property, the phone, the laptop, and the briefcase. Hand them over, and we can make this a civil transition." Marcus clutched his leather briefcase to his chest. It contained his physical backup, the paper trail he'd kept as a matter of habit, the one thing Sterling couldn't delete with a keystroke. "I don't know who you are, but I'm calling the police." The man on the right laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "With what phone, Marcus? You're a ghost, and ghosts don't have rights." They lunged. The first man reached for the briefcase, his fingers like iron talons. Marcus didn't think. He reacted. He swung the heavy leather case with every ounce of terror-fueled strength he possessed. The corner of the case caught the man squarely in the jaw with a sickening crack. The sound of bone meeting reinforced leather. The man let out a choked grunt and stumbled back, clutching his face as blood began to seep through his fingers. The second attacker roared, throwing a heavy punch that grazed Marcus's temple, sending a white-hot flash of pain through his skull. Marcus tumbled to the hot asphalt, the smell of dust and old oil filling his nose. He scrambled backward, his shoes skidding on the grit. The attacker reached for his collar, but Marcus kicked out, his heel connecting with the man's shin. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his teeth, and dove into the driver's seat of the rental car. He jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a desperate whine. He slammed the car into reverse, the tires screaming as they tore across the cracked concrete, leaving the two men in a cloud of blue smoke and stinging dust. He drove blindly for miles, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep the car between the lines. He needed a sanctuary, a place where the digital reach of Robert Sterling couldn't touch him. He found it 3 towns over, a greasy spoon diner called the Rusty Anchor, tucked between a warehouse and a shipping canal. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. In a back booth, shrouded by the steam of a dishwasher, sat Sarah Jenkins. Sarah looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her thick-rimmed glasses were smudged, and she was obsessively checking a small notebook. When Marcus slid into the booth, she jumped, nearly knocking over her mug. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice a frantic flutter. "You shouldn't have come." "They're watching everyone who got let go." "I have nowhere else to go, Sarah. Sterling wiped me out. My accounts, my ID, everything." He leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "You said you had something? Something physical." Sarah reached into her purse, her fingers trembling. She pulled out a small, silver flash drive. "This is the audit schedule. The real one. Not the version they showed the board. It shows where the money went before the relocation started." She paused, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp terror. "Marcus, I have to log this. I have to put it in my book. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For what? You're helping me, Sarah. Subverted. Marcus took the drive, feeling a surge of genuine hope. This was it. The physical evidence? He could take this to the authorities, show them the discrepancies, and prove that Sterling was the one moving the money. He looked at Sarah, offering a small, tired smile. This changes everything. With this, I can go to the feds. I can show them the trail. You've saved me, Sarah. Truly, Sarah didn't smile back. She looked at her notebook, her pen scratching a frantic rhythm against the paper. I hope so. I needed to balance it. I needed to make sure I wasn't the one who caused the crash. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been a man drowning, and Sarah had thrown him a line. He gripped the drive tightly in his palm, the cold metal a promise of a future. He could see the path forward. A quiet meeting with an investigator. A deposition. The slow but inevitable collapse of Sterling's empire. He felt his shoulders drop for the first time in hours. He took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, the bitterness tasting like victory. The relocation bonus, Sarah said suddenly, her voice dropping to a ghost of a sound. The $50,000 they put in your account last month to cover the Houston move. You spent some of that, right? To clear your debts in Chicago? Marcus nodded. Of course. It was part of the contract. Why? Sarah finally looked up, and the pity in her eyes made the blood in Marcus's veins turn to slush. Marcus, that wasn't company money. I checked the routing numbers on the drive before I left. Sterling didn't use the corporate treasury. Marcus frowned, a cold prickle dancing across his skin. Then where did it come from? The employee pension fund, Sarah whispered. Specifically, the accounts for the warehouse workers in the Midwest. He moved the money through a shell company, but the final transfer, the one that hit your account, was authorized using your personal security key. He didn't just give you a bonus, Marcus. He made it look like you stole the retirement savings of 300 families to pay off your credit cards. The world tilted. The diner, the smell of grease, the humming of the refrigerator. It all felt suddenly distant, as if he were looking at it through a thick pane of glass. He wasn't just a victim of a corporate firing. He was the face of a federal felony. The bonus he had used to pay his rent and his father's medical bills was a neon sign pointing directly to his guilt. Sterling hadn't just taken his job. He had turned Marcus into the most hated man in the company. He had given Marcus the money so that Marcus would be the one holding the smoking gun when the feds finally came knocking. The police, Marcus gasped, his throat tightening. If they see that transfer. They already have, Sarah said, her voice trembling. That's why your accounts were frozen, not because of a company error, because of a federal seizure warrant. Marcus, you aren't just a fugitive from Sterling. You're a fugitive from the United States government. Marcus stood up so abruptly, his knees hit the underside of the table with a dull thud. He had thought he was playing a game of corporate chess, but Sterling had been playing a game of total annihilation. He looked at the flash drive in his hand. It wasn't a shield. It was a weight that would drown him. He turned and ran for the door, the bell chiming a mocking goodbye as he burst back out into the suffocating Houston heat. He didn't go back to his car. He knew the rental would be flagged, a digital beacon for every patrol car in the state. Instead, he began to walk. He moved toward the outskirts, where the glass towers of the city gave way to the sprawling, lonely expanse of the Texas brush. The sun beat down on his charcoal suit, turning the fabric into a furnace. Sweat stung his eyes, and the salt tasted like failure. He found a dense patch of woods near the interstate, the ground covered in a thick carpet of rotting pine needles and discarded trash. He pushed through the undergrowth, the thorns of a blackberry bush tearing at the expensive wool of his trousers. He reached a small clearing and stopped, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He needed to disappear. He took off his suit jacket and buried it under a pile of damp leaves, the charcoal fabric vanishing into the mulch. He did the same with his tie, the silk feeling like a noose he was finally removing. He was left in his white dress shirt, now stained with sweat and dirt, a man stripped of his armor. He began to trek parallel to the highway, staying deep within the shadows of the trees. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, he pressed his body against the rough bark of an oak, his heart hammering until his ribs ached. By nightfall, he reached a roadside motel, a crumbling U-shaped building with a flickering neon sign that hummed a low, dissonant C-sharp. The air smelled of damp concrete and cheap cigarettes. He approached the lobby window, his hand in his pocket, grinding the sea glass until his thumb bled. He had a few crumpled 20s tucked into his shoe, the only money the digital purge hadn't touched. As he reached for the door handle, he stopped. Taped to the inside of the glass was a printout from the local precinct's social media page. It was his face, a professional headshot from the Nexus website. Under the bold, black heading, "Wanted for federal fraud." Armed and dangerous. The word "armed" was a lie, a tactical addition to ensure the police would approach him with triggers ready. He backed away from the door, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the asphalt. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay anywhere. He was a virus in the system, and the system was actively trying to purge him. He found temporary refuge in a 24-hour laundromat adjacent to the motel. The room was a cavern of white noise, the hum of 30 industrial dryers vibrating through the floorboards and into his teeth. The air was thick and humid, smelling of artificial lavender and hot lint. He sat in the back, hunched over a folding table, trying to blend into the shadows. Through the front window, across the street, he saw it. A black SUV, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl. The windows were tinted, but the street lamp caught the driver's face for a split second. The man wasn't looking at the motel. He wasn't looking for Marcus. He was staring at a tablet screen, and on that screen was an overhead map of a small, Victorian-style house in a suburb of Illinois. Marcus felt a coldness more profound than the Texas night. That was his mother's house. Sterling wasn't just hunting Marcus. He was mapping out the collateral damage. He was showing Marcus that there were no boundaries, no sanctuaries. If Marcus didn't surrender the drive, if he didn't play the role of the fall guy, the fire would spread. The Sterling count wasn't just for ceiling tiles. It was for lives. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He needed to move. He slipped out the back exit of the laundromat, into a narrow alleyway choked with overflowing dumpsters and the stench of rotting grease. The brick walls felt like they were leaning in, suffocating him. A low, haunting hum drifted through the alley. It was a funeral dirge, a melody of grief and finality. Marcus froze. From the shadows near a stack of wooden pallets, a figure emerged. He was a slab of granite in a tactical jacket, his eyes flat and devoid of emotion. "Miller, you're a hard man to track, Thorne," Miller said, his voice a gravelly whisper that barely rose above the hum. "But everyone eventually returns to the dirt." Miller didn't wait for a response. He moved with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. He lunged, his fist a blur of motion, Marcus ducked, the wind of the punch whistling past his ear. He swung a desperate blow at Miller's midsection, but it was like hitting a brick wall. Miller countered with a knee to Marcus's ribs, the impact stealing the air from his lungs and sending him crashing into a pile of trash. "Sterling wants the drive," Miller said, stepping closer, the funeral dirge never wavering. "He said I could have the rest." Marcus scrambled backward, his hand searching the grime for a weapon. His fingers closed around a heavy glass bottle. He smashed it against the brick wall and lunged, but Miller caught his wrist in a grip that felt like a vice. The bone groaned, and Marcus cried out, the bottle shattering on the ground. Miller threw him against the steel door of the building, the impact rattling Marcus's brain. He was going to die here, in an alley that smelled of rancid fat, killed by a man who sang to his victims. Desperation sparked a final, frantic thought. Above the door was a red box with a glass front, the emergency fire suppression pull. Marcus reached up, his fingers screaming in pain, and yanked the handle down. A siren shrieked, a high-pitched wail that vibrated in the very marrow of his bones. A split second later, the sealing nozzles erupted. A deluge of thick white chemical foam poured into the alley, a blinding blizzard of stinging soap. Miller roared as the foam hit his eyes. He stumbled back, his tactical precision wiped away by the whiteout. Marcus didn't wait. He stayed low, crawling through the waist-deep foam, the chemical smell burning his throat. He felt the exit to the street, a gap in the white wall, and threw himself through it. He ran into the dark, his lungs burning, the sound of the siren fading into the distance, leaving him alone in the suffocating Texas night. He found himself at a public library the next morning, waiting for the doors to creak open. He looked like a vagrant, his shirt torn, his face bruised, his skin covered in a thin film of dried fire foam. He sat at a terminal in the far corner, the hum of the computer fans a low, steady drone. He pulled the silver flash drive from his pocket. Subverted. He needed to see the depth of the hole he was in. He plugged the drive into the port, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He would find the proof. He would find the evidence that Sterling had acted alone, that the transfers were unauthorized. He could use this to clear his name, to show the feds that he was a pawn, not a player. He clicked on the primary ledger, his eyes scanning the lines of code and currency. There, a transfer for $4 million, dated 3 months ago. The authorization field was populated with a digital signature. Marcus leaned in, a sense of grim satisfaction rising in his chest. This was the smoking gun. He just needed to show that the signature was a forgery, a crude imitation of his own. He opened the signature metadata, the underlying layers of the digital thumbprint. He expected to see a mismatch, a different IP address, a timestamp that didn't align with his whereabouts. He clicked the final folder. The screen flickered, then displayed a high-resolution log of the signature's creation. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The signature wasn't a forgery. The metadata showed that the security key used to authorize the theft had been generated on his own personal laptop in his own home office on a Tuesday evening when he had been sitting on his couch, watching a movie with his mother. The IP address was his. The hardware ID was his. It wasn't a clone of his signature. It was a clone of his entire digital identity. Sterling hadn't just copied his name. He had spent months building a digital twin of Marcus Thorne. Every email Marcus had sent, every site he had visited, every password he had typed had been mirrored on a hidden server. The Marcus who had authorized the theft wasn't a fake. To any computer in the world, it was Marcus. The drive didn't prove his innocence. It proved his absolute, undeniable guilt. If he handed this to the FBI, they wouldn't see a conspiracy. They would see a master criminal who had meticulously documented his own heist. Sterling hadn't left him a breadcrumb trail to the truth. He had handed him the shovel to bury his own grave. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He slumped in the hard plastic chair, the light of the monitor reflecting in his hollow eyes. He had no evidence. He had no identity. He was a man framed by his own ghost. He pulled the drive from the port, the metal feeling hot, as if it were burning his skin. He needed to find another way. He needed to go to the source. The drive to Austin was a blur of gray asphalt and rising panic. He had managed to hotwire an abandoned truck, a rusted Ford that smelled of wet dog and old hay. He reached the city as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the glass towers of the Capitol. The Ethics and Industry Gala was being held at the Driscoll Hotel, a fortress of limestone and marble. The street was lined with black limousines, their polished surfaces reflecting the camera flashes of the waiting press. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of high society chatter. Marcus stood in the shadows of a parking garage across the street, his hand trembling as he watched the elite of the Texas business world file into the building. Somewhere in there, Robert Sterling was preparing to take his victory lap. Looking for a way in? Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the sea glass. A man stood in the shadows of a concrete pillar. He wore a suit that was expensive 3 years ago, now frayed at the cuffs and smelling faintly of cheap gin. David Vance. "I know you," Marcus said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The Chronicle. You were the one who broke the Nexus expansion story." Vance cracked his knuckles, thumb, index, pinky. The sound a sharp pop, pop, pop in the quiet garage. "I was. Until Sterling bought my editor and turned my lead source into a ghost. I've been following you since Houston, Marcus. I knew he'd pick a fall guy eventually. He didn't just pick me, David. He erased me." Vance stepped into the light, a predatory glint in his eyes. "I can get you in. I still have my old press credentials, and I know the service entrance protocols. We get the drive to the main server, we broadcast the ledger to the whole room. We burn him down in front of his peers." Marcus looked at the hotel, then back at Vance. He had no other choice. "Why help me?" Vance cracked his knuckles again. "Because I want to see the look on his face when the world finds out he's not a genius. He's just a thief with a better tailor." They moved through the rain-slicked alleyways, a pair of ghosts haunting the edges of the gala. Vance led him to a heavy steel door near the loading docks. He swiped a tarnished security card, and the lock clicked open with a heavy, mechanical thud. The service corridors were a stark contrast to the opulence above. The walls were bare concrete, the air thick with the smell of industrial cleaner and the hum of massive HVAC units. Marcus followed Vance through the maze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The server room is through the basement utility tunnels," Vance whispered, his breath smelling of mints and decay. "Once we're in, you do your magic. I'll handle the distraction." They descended a narrow flight of stairs into the bowels of the building. The ceiling was a tangled gutwork of pipes that seemed to be sagging lower by the minute. The darkness in the corners was absolute, feeling heavy enough to crush a flashlight beam. Suddenly, a low, vibrating hum filled the corridor. The funeral dirge. Miller stepped out from behind a massive boiler, his tactical jacket covered in a fine layer of frost. He looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. "Go!" Marcus yelled, shoving Vance toward a side door. Miller lunged, his movement a blur of violence. He caught Marcus with a heavy shoulder tackle, sending them both crashing into a row of metal shelves. Tools and spare parts rained down on them, the clatter deafening in the narrow space. Marcus fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He bit, he scratched, he used every dirty trick he had learned in the last 48 hours. He managed to scramble to his feet and lure Miller toward a heavy, insulated door marked cold storage. Sensitive samples. As Miller lunged again, Marcus stepped aside and shoved the giant with everything he had. Miller tumbled into the freezing vault, the air inside a misty white shroud of sub-zero temperature. Marcus slammed the door shut and threw the heavy steel bolt. The sound of Miller's fists hitting the door was a dull, rhythmic thud, like a hammer hitting a coffin. Marcus leaned against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had won. He had neutralized the hunter. He ran back to the meeting point, his heart light with a sudden, soaring hope. He would find Vance. They would upload the drive, and the nightmare would be over. But when he reached the utility room, the space was empty. Subverted. "David?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. His phone, the burner he had bought in a gas station, vibrated in his pocket. A single text message from an unknown number. "Thanks for the drive, Marcus. Sterling pays much better than a disgraced journalist ever could. Check the monitor." V. Marcus looked up at a small security monitor mounted on the wall. It showed the main ballroom, where Robert Sterling was standing at a podium, a glass of champagne in his hand. Next to him, smiling like a proud brother, was David Vance. Vance was holding the silver flash drive. He handed it to Sterling, who tucked it into his breast pocket with a graceful, practiced motion. The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. Vance hadn't been a victim. He had been a lure. Sterling had known Marcus would seek out an ally, and he had provided one. The drive, the only physical evidence of the digital cloning, was now in the hands of the man who had created it. Marcus had handed his own execution warrant to his executioner. The sound of heavy boots and the sharp, frantic barking of police dogs began to echo through the vents. The building's security team was initiating a total lockdown. They weren't just looking for a trespasser. They were looking for a dangerous, armed felon who was trapped in the basement. Marcus looked around the utility room. There was no way out. The service elevators were locked, the stairs were guarded, and the police were closing in. He could hear the rhythm of the boots getting louder, a steady, inevitable drumbeat. On the monitor, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Sterling raised his glass, his eyes crinkling in a warm, fatherly smile. He had won. He had stolen the money, framed the protégé, and now he was being celebrated as a titan of ethics. Marcus sank to the floor, his back against the cold concrete. He looked at the sea glass in his hand, the edges now smooth and dull. He had tried to play by the rules of a world that had no rules. He had tried to find a truth in a system built on lies. The first of the police dogs burst through the door, its growl a low, predatory rumble. Marcus didn't move. He didn't resist. He just watched the monitor as Robert Sterling took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. The Sterling count, finally complete. But as the officers tackled him to the floor, their knees grinding his face into the grit, Marcus saw something on the screen that Vance had overlooked. In the corner of the private lounge, where Sterling had retreated for a final moment of quiet, a small, high-definition monitor showed a live feed of the room itself. But there was a 5-second delay. Marcus realized that the ghost in the system wasn't just him. It was the system itself. He reached out, his fingers brushing a service tablet that had been left on a nearby workbench. It was connected to the building's internal network, a tool for the janitorial staff. He didn't need the flash drive. He didn't need a signature. He needed a broadcast. With the last of his strength, before the handcuffs bit into his wrists, Marcus swiped a sequence he had learned in his first week at Nexus. A simple override, a way to test the ballroom's main screen. He didn't upload the ledger. He didn't upload the code. He uploaded the live feed from his own hidden lapel camera, the one Vance had forgotten to check in his haste to collect the drive. The ballroom screen flickered, then filled with the image of Robert Sterling in the private lounge, leaning over to David Vance. "You did well, David." Sterling's voice boomed through the ballroom's high-end speakers, clear and unmistakable. "The feds will have Thorne by midnight. The pension money is already in the Cayman accounts. A clean sweep." The silence that fell over the gala was more profound than any noise Marcus had ever heard. It was the sound of 1,000 people realizing they had been applauding a monster. Marcus felt the pressure on his back ease as the officers looked up at the screen. He closed his eyes, the smell of the damp basement fading away. He had lost his career. He had lost his savings. He had lost the life he thought he wanted. But as he was led out of the building, not as a felon, but as a witness, Marcus Thorne felt the sharp edge of the sea glass in his pocket and knew that for the first time in his life, he was finally holding on to reality. Years later, in the quiet, dusty heat of El Paso, Marcus sat in a modest law clinic. The air smelled of old paper and desert wind. He wasn't wearing a charcoal suit. He was wearing a simple cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that were no longer shaking. He looked out the window at the shimmering horizon, where the earth met the sky in a liquid, shifting mirror. He didn't count the ceiling tiles. He didn't check the metrics. He just watched the sun set. A man who had traded a ladder for a foundation, and found that the view from the ground was much clearer than the view from the top.